want to do a series on Nobel Prize winners gone bad, because there's a few examples of Nobel Prize winners who, like, you know, save lives, and they're like, oh wait, but you know,
well,
also
Nobel.
good
You
for
could start with Nobel.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to The Climate Question from the BBC World Service. I'm Greer Jackson, and this week you're taking over the show with your questions, including ancient ice cores. How easy is it to date them? And which green jobs will be most valuable in a warmer world? Plus, could nitrous oxide emissions become a problem in the future? Don't forget, if you have a question you would like us to answer in a future show, you can comment them below. To answer your questions, we have our usual panel of experts. We have Caroline Steele, host of Crowd Science on the BBC World Service, and our resident science expert. Hello, Caroline.
Hi, Greer. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. We have Akshat Rati, a senior climate reporter at Bloomberg Green. Good to have you here.
Nice to be here.
And our very own Justin Rolat, the BBC's climate editor.
Lovely to be here, thank you.
Now, Caroline, you have a new series that's just about to broadcast on the BBC World Service, No Man's Land, which you interviewed all of us for. Yeah. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I've spent the last few months trying to find somewhere on Earth unaffected by humans. And so I don't just mean somewhere that we haven't visited, I mean somewhere that we haven't changed entirely. And
haven't changed at all.
Haven't changed at all, yeah. And as part of that process, I spoke to all three of you, and you all tried.
And you didn't use any. I mean, like, I was there for like 3 seconds.
And you all featured briefly. Thank you so much for your help.
What did you guess as the place, Justin?
Oh, mine were terrible. As soon as I spoke to you about it, I mean, I talked about the abyssal floor of the ocean.
Yes, you went ocean was your
yeah,
sort of...
and kind of obviously plastics would have kind of floated down to that. So it was quite, I felt slightly ashamed. And then I also talked about the end of I went to Thwaites Glacier once, so I claimed to have been to but clearly if I'd been there, it would have been changed anyway. But I went there to report climate change, so the glacier had changed massively anyway. A glacier in the West Antarctic.
Yes, but you weren't miles off with the
Yeah, I was
glacier.
above.
Well, yeah,
you're
a bit high.
Yeah.
But you're in the right general area.
I thought I guessed it with the caves.
Actually, I think of the three of you, actually out of everyone I interviewed, if I'm giving you scores out of 10, actually you get 10. I think you guessed both of the places that I found. So the two places that I found were subglacial lakes, so that's sort of underneath
Hang on a
glaciers.
second, I said the bottom of a glacier.
Oh, did you? Okay,
Yeah.
well, I'll give you 9 out of 10 then. So there's subglacial lakes. Basically, underneath glaciers, there are amazing lakes that have life in them and have never been touched or changed by humans at all. And then also caves, that's particularly called hypergenic caves, which don't have entrances and form in a very interesting sort of geological way, which means that they aren't in any way attached to the surface. And there are, thousands of kilometres of these underneath our feet that I didn't even know about. So, yeah.
Well, I guess for the answer, we'll have to tune in or find No Man's Land wherever you get your podcast.
Yes, or I did just do a massive
I was going to
spoiler.
say, it was a huge
You said you gave
spoiler.
one of 2 options, but I mean, Justin, you're just back from the Global Climate Summit COP.
Me and
Did you?
Akshat, yeah.
Both of you. Did you manage to escape
I
the
did
venue?
manage to escape. I went and did a story in the kind of Amazon itself. So I went up the river. We were in Belém, which is kind of near the mouth of the Amazon. I went up to a place called Santarém to do a story on deforestation and looking at a challenge. Brazilian farmers are challenging a moratorium, an agreement made by big buyers of soya not to buy soya from recently deforested land. And we were looking at the role that this moratorium had played, and went into the Amazon and kind of went to see a scientific experiment that looked at the impact of deforestation, looked at the way it's changing the kind of microclimate and the wider global climate.
And Akshat, you were also at COP,
I
but I
was.
know you're also now working on a new story that is your favourite subject.
Yeah, electricity. I've been doing the series called Bottlenecks, looking at what's been holding back electricity supply, not just in places like data centers, but just across rich countries. And it's been really fun to do it. And I wanted to finally finish the series by looking at a different question, which is, why are we asking the question about shortage of electricity? Is it just because of AI data centers and, trying to feed big tech? No, really, electricity now is a fundamental driving force for economic growth. And we've known that in developing countries for a long time, right? There's been like 3 decades of research looking at if you supply or give access of electricity to poor people, they become economically better. And vice versa, if they are growing, they will demand more electricity. In industrialized nations, that wasn't the case because they were actually deindustrializing. So electricity consumption was falling and economies were growing. Now that's flipped. So now we can see, and we've got exclusive analysis from Bloomberg Economics looking at rich countries and seeing when there is stress in their electricity system, their economic growth starts to fall.
Interesting. I mean, this kind of leads us quite nicely onto our first question from Liv. She writes, I'm a girl in my 20s from Norway. I was wondering what kind of work skills are most needed in the climate change sphere? For example, is it engineers, chemists that are most needed, or is it people with computer or social skills? Now, thanks, Liv. The fight against climate change is one of the biggest drivers transforming our global market economy. That's labour market, I should say. That's according to the World Economic Forum. Actually, let's start with you. Electricity and engineer jobs. I know you've talked about a lot on your podcast, Zero.
Yeah, in Bottlenecks, one of the feature stories was looking at the shortage of engineers across rich countries. So certainly, if you think you want to try and tackle climate change, engineering is a good place to go. But I would take a step back and I would just say, really, you should do what you're passionate about. And climate requires all sorts of people, everybody from people studying social sciences all the way to hard sciences, people studying politics, going into arts. So do what you're passionate about, but then think about climate change in your profession and how you can use your skills to try and further the case for climate action.
Caroline, when I was looking down at the data, there's still quite a big gender gap in the skills sets there, in green skills that we've been needing. I mean, why is it so important, do you think, to close that gap? And since you work in science, have you seen any sort of like interesting solutions to that?
Yeah, I was surprised at how much of a gender gap there is because 70% of the world's polluting jobs are done by men. So you'd kind of almost think that this is a chance for new jobs and you might see more women fill the space. But according to the International Monetary Fund, in advancing economies, 20% of men have green jobs, whereas only 6% of women do. So there is quite a big gap. And I think it might be down to not having as many women doing STEM degrees and going on to, do further STEM degrees. We sort of see a drop off with women in STEM, so that's science, technology, engineering and maths with time. And interestingly, Ireland have done a lot to combat this, and they've had a really big difference in a short period of time. So they've tripled the number of young women entering STEM degrees in just 8 years. And they've done that by basically introducing learning science earlier, targeting young girls, and also training teachers in the gender STEM gap and why it matters and what they can do about it. So I think Ireland a pretty good example for what we can do to kind of combat it.
Justin?
Well, I was wondering, isn't one of the issues that some of the jobs that it's creating are traditionally male roles like plumbing and kind of the sort of thing you'd need to do to install solar panels is a sort of, it's a kind of a craft skill that traditionally has been done by men.
Yes.
So it may just be that actually the new jobs are kind of jobs that have typically been kind of male focused.
That's true. So it looks like, the World Economic Forum published a sort of fastest growing jobs report, and in the top 15 fastest growing jobs, the climate relevant ones I could find were renewable energy engineers, environmental engineers, and electric and autonomous vehicle specialists. So yeah, those are kind of what have traditionally been male leaning roles. But I guess this is kind of an opportunity because there's going to be a new set of skills that people need to kind of train up young women to fill this space and adjust that STEM gender gap.
I do wonder, what are the non-technical jobs though, right? Like we're sitting here and we're communicators, right? That might be a good example. Akshat?
I think a people-oriented job is one that applies across fields, and I think you need more people-oriented people in climate, because one of the biggest things you can do is actually swing the politics in the right direction. And that is a completely people's job. And so I think the other one is managers, right? People who can enable other people to do the work. And that requires a certain set of skills that not everybody has.
Justin?
Well, I think this is a revolution that's going to change the way we use energy throughout all industries, and therefore kind of all jobs in the future will have a component in which they're dealing with the consequences of those big fundamental changes. My daughter's just got a job. She works for what you might describe, I think actually we'll be able to guess what company I'm talking about, an electrotech company. And, she didn't have a huge interest in climate change, but now is doing, kind of publicity for this company and is now massively interested in the kind of electric future. So, there are jobs across the board in this. And I would say absolutely supporting what Akshat says. And people often ask us, don't they, what can I do to help? And always in everything, follow your passion, follow what you want to do. Don't feel that there's a prescribed path.
Thanks so much for your question, Liv. Next, we have one from James on YouTube. And he wonders, could nitrous oxide emissions become a problem in future? Caroline, let's just start with what exactly is nitrous oxide?
So it's a gas. It's a clear gas. Apparently it smells a bit sweet, and it's made up of molecules that have 2 nitrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. And it is a greenhouse gas, and it already is a problem.
How much of a problem?
Well, so according to a Nature paper, it's 300 times more effective at warming our planet than carbon dioxide is. And according to scientists at the IPCC, it already makes up 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not as much of a problem as carbon dioxide or methane, but it's already a problem.
Yeah, I mean, there are a range of estimates there. I've seen as much as 10% of net global warming since the Industrial Revolution, so higher. Where does it come from? I know there's natural sources, but what are the human sources?
Yeah, so the main human source of nitrous oxide comes from farming, basically, and particularly nitrogen fertilizers. So plants need nitrogen to grow, and if we just kind of leave them to it, they take nitrogen out of the soil, they grow, they die, they rot in the soil, they go on to sort of replace the nitrogen they took, other plants then use it to grow. But the issue with farming is we harvest the crops, and so the nitrogen doesn't get replaced in the soil. So we need to do that. And that's sort of long been a problem. Farmers have been trying to work out how to replace this nitrogen. Things like composting helps.
Manure,
exactly. But frustratingly, 78% of air around us is nitrogen. So there's actually loads of it there, but plants can't use it basically because nitrogen gas is 2 nitrogen atoms with a triple bond between them that's really, really strong and hard to break. But in 1908, a scientist called Fritz Haber, who was a German scientist, basically came up with a way of taking nitrogen out of the air and making it usable for plants. And it involves taking nitrogen gas, hydrogen gas, putting them under extreme temperatures and pressures, and out the other end you get ammonia, which is kind of a form of nitrogen that can be adjusted and goes on to form nitrogen fertilizer, which plants then take up and use. The difficult bit is that process of converting the nitrogen fertilizer into nitrates, which is what the plants use, releases nitrous oxide, particularly if you use too much fertilizer. So that's where the problem comes from. But nitrogen fertilizers are kind of amazing. So
feed the world.
They literally feed the world, yeah. So a patch of land that uses nitrogen fertilizer can grow more plants than without it. It's literally half the world's population rely on food that is grown using nitrogen fertilizer. So in some ways, Haber, the scientist, kind of saved billions of lives, because at the time that he came up with this process, we had a hugely growing population. We just didn't have enough food to feed them. And now, since that time, the population has grown 4 times over.
And the trouble is we don't have very good solutions to tackle nitrogen emissions.
Although, having said that, farmers are more careful about how they use fertilizer, not just for environmental reasons, but also because it's really expensive. And when you go to farms now, they're much more precise about how they use it.
It's really interesting how they do it. I was covering a story in Kenya where they were using a drone to fly over the field and look at the crop health, and then they could map exactly
look at how green it is.
Yeah, exactly what nutrients were needed in which part of the field. So they only sprayed a section of the field rather than blanket spraying the whole field.
Yeah, it's like about getting the right crop at the right time of year, putting it in the right place. You can really reduce the amount you use. But it's not the equivalent to, say, carbon dioxide, where we have solutions. This is like, we do need it to feed people.
And precision farming is something that can help. The challenge is that the people who will deploy it, especially in developing countries, are smallholder farmers, and trying to get them to be educated about this and then bringing them technology. That's just a much, much harder problem than being able to put solar panels
Although
on the
the
roof.
Yeah.
huge cost of fertilizer is a factor that does encourage people to be more careful with it.
I don't think we can talk about Fritz Haber without
I was
talking
about
about the fact that he was also the scientist who invented
the gas
Zyklon B,
chambers, yeah.
and which was then used by the Nazis to kill
Yes.
Jews.
Well, the other half of the nitrogen story is that the ammonia that they used, they then used to make munitions
TNT.
during the First World War.
So he was a huge part
he
of
was
that.
responsible for a lot of the conflict in the First World War, and then went on to not only that, he was Jewish.
Yes.
But disguised his identity to remain in the German elite.
Yeah, he's such a controversial figure.
Yeah.
And he went on to win a Nobel Prize for his work with nitrogen fertilizers.
And we've also got to see the context in which he discovered it. I mean, the world was running out. We'd had supplies of fertilizer that were quite easy. Guano on islands in the Pacific Ocean had been mined. Thousands of years of the deposits of bird poo on islands were being used to fertilize fields in Europe, which were becoming much, much less fertile. And then this came just at the moment when there was reckoned to be a fertility crisis in agriculture. So it was an amazing, it was an absolutely, civilization-defining discovery, frankly, for which he probably does deserve a Nobel Prize. People had tried to crack it before and had failed.
Yeah.
But with such a complex, it's fascinating
Yeah.
story.
I want to do a series on Nobel Prize winners gone bad, because there's a few examples of Nobel Prize winners who, save lives, and then oh, wait, but,
Well,
also
Nobel.
good
You
for
could start with
explosive.
Nobel.
That's the thing, is that it's this interesting philosophy here that scientists don't really have much control what their, inventions or discoveries are used for.
Yes.
Science is supposed to be, for the bettering
You find out
yes.
for the sake of knowledge and that kind of thing. Yes, but he did literally campaign to turn his nitrogen fertilizer factory.
Scrap that then.
The worst example of this is actually not a Nobel Prize winner. It's a chemist named Thomas Midgley Jr. who invented tetraethyl lead, so leaded petrol, and CFCs. And was much celebrated in the first half of the 20th century as a chemist who invented things that made life really better. Because, having leaded petrol meant your cars could last much longer and you didn't have that much knockback. And CFCs allowed you to have refrigeration that was so good, except, of course, it caused people to become criminal, all the lead that people consumed, and CFCs created the ozone hole. So in the second half of the 20th century, we find out.
Well, let's finish that up by saying the good news is the latest evidence is that the ozone hole is closing. It's one of the smallest ozone holes we've had.
And that loops us back to nitrous oxide, because that is now the number one ozone hole depleter, because we've addressed the CFC problem.
Right. Okay. That brings us
Drawing
nicely.
all together.
Join it all together. Brilliant. Well done, team. Akshat, this last question is for you. It's from Mike in New Zealand. And he writes, I've just listened to the Climate Question programme on the collection and analysing of ice cores. It was very interesting. Thank you, Mike. Check out the Climate Question podcast if you want to hear that episode. It's called What Do Ice Cores Tell Us About Climate Change? Now, Mike wants to know, how do you know what the age of each ice core is? With tree rings, it's quite easy because there's normally a new ring each year. But with ice cores, I assume this method won't work, as there may not be snow every year, and it also goes back thousands of years. Akshat.
Well, it doesn't just go thousands of years, it goes hundreds of thousands of years back.
Maybe even 1.5 million years ago.
Indeed. And that kind of data is really important, because if we can look back in past so far and understand what the chemistry in the atmosphere did to the planet, then we could conceivably think about our future. And it's really important. Now, you can actually count it like tree rings, at least in the recent past. So there is enough of a seasonality when it comes to snow that you can count the years go past as the snow falls. But the further back you go in time, the harder it becomes and the more uncertainty there is. So there are a few ways in which scientists then take those data points and then compare it to events that we know happen. So volcanoes are a really good example of that. When they blow up, they put up all this sort of ash into the atmosphere. Typically for large volcanic eruptions, you really don't have to worry about where they happen, because they go high into the atmosphere and then settle back down, often on the poles, and you get a layer of ash in the ice core, and then you can compare it to what age the ice core might have been. The other is to look at air pockets, which also get trapped in these ice cores, and then analyze the mixture inside it. So you get obviously oxygen, but you'll get water because it's made up of ice. You'll get other types of gases, and you can use that to try and analyze what type of motion did the planet go through, and when in the age of the planet did that happen. And then you create models, because that's where the uncertainty comes in. It's not like tree rings where you can be counting with your fingers and be very specific. You have to create models to try and correlate these different data points, where we can compare it to historical past, but also to chemistry events that we know correlate to a particular event on the planet. And then you come up with a model that gives you maybe as much as 1.5 million years of climate
It's complicated
data.
And there are lots of data points, Mike. I mean, you were talking about the air bubbles there, and I did go to the British Antarctic Survey and saw part of an ice core, and I was amazed how many bubbles there were. It's not like ice, it's also just so beautiful, in fact.
And if you put it, I mean, it sounds so, if you put it in your mouth, it pops. It's like a...
Does it taste, well, I didn't do that, but does it taste different from regular ice?
Well, I mean, it's sensationally different in that it pops and crackles. I can't remember it tasting any different.
I just wonder if ice from 1.5 million years ago tastes different.
There's a lot of ice knocking around in Antarctica. So when we were there, you put it in your whiskey.
Wow.
And it would crackle. It was great.
And you're sort of like eating ancient air.
Yeah, or eating ancient air. Yeah,
Very
absolutely.
cool.
Yeah.
I also think it's really cool how accurately you can date something so old, because like for hundreds of thousands of years ago, you can accurately date to like a few hundred years, which as a fraction is, amazing. I barely know how old, I don't know, my courgettes are in my fridge.
I was going to say, you are? Mike, I hope that answers your question. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for all your help this week, Akshat, Caroline and Justin.
Thank you. This was fun, as always.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Cheers. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
And thank you so much for watching. Don't forget you can subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel so you don't miss an episode. And as I said before, you can also write your questions below and we'll get to them in a future show. I'm Greg Jackson and we'll see you next time.